Today I wanted to discuss something that is super important to get at the heart of political discussions. So if you're anything like me or you're terminally online, you'll have the opportunity to bear witness to dozens or hundreds of podcasts and talks and comments and all this commentariat around politics both in the UK and the US, because obviously these are the most important Anglo countries when it comes to political outcomes. You can even see with, at least on X, Elon Musk showing quite a lot of interest in the current state of the British Parliament and political milieu. Which is to say, it's worth looking at the politics a little bit more historically perhaps, but then also maybe not metaphysically but metapolitically, where we'll say the understanding of how we've gotten to where we are, and I have covered this in different angles at least previously, is around the typology of power and politics in the Anglosphere, and that it's quite frustrating to have this bi-party system, parliamentary system, where it always feels very farcical and like pageantry. So I'll delve a little bit into that. Now, I don't like using quotes and reading directly to a video. You can read a book yourself, but I will use quite a few quotes here in this chat just to highlight and emphasize how it's historically been propositioned that America is and the UK are these countries which are dealing with a morphological change in how politics is being both felt and enacted or used. So I think in terms of real discussion, we'll delve into exactly why politicians are more or less terrible nowadays. There's complete lack of quality amongst politicians, and that even with smart people working in politics, there's still an overall collective, you might call it imbecility, but the level of intelligence has dropped, not even on an average basis, but just a collective basis in the way that opinions and thoughts are formed in these situations and forums. So here I'll just read out the Spengler quote from, I think, Prussianism and Socialism, where he goes on to say, "The question therefore arises concerning the relationship between people and party. What meaning can elections have in the modern Western nations? Who does the electing, and whom or what does he elect? The sense of the English system is that the people elect a party, and not just a representative of its will and opinions, for these are more or less influenced by the party leadership in any case. The parties are very old and firmly established institutions whose business it is to conduct the political affairs of the entire English nation. The individual Englishman realizes the practicality of such an institution, and from election to election he supports the party whose declared intentions correspond most closely with his own opinions and interests. He also realizes the unimportance of the individual representative, appointed quite arbitrarily by the party. Indeed, the phrase fatuous electorate fits the average representative better than the voting mass itself. It is significant that English workers have quite often voted for an employer nominated by one of the age-old parties rather than for a workman candidate. In each case, after sober appraisal of the situation, they have regarded it as more advantageous to vote this way. In America, where the genuine Englishman no longer stands behind the system, the custom now is for the parties to deliver one set of promises to the people, and another to the trust that fills the party's coffers. This first set is published, the second is kept." Now, you may think that this could have been written other than the quite interesting usage of language, something written today, given that the primacy and the relevance of the topics discussed in the style and the metapolitical formations that these observations take is one representative of today. In the UK, the party has something called pre-selection, where a candidate is nominated internally by the party to stand on for an electorate, which is more or less a way of giving pretense to the sense that you're voting for a person to represent you, but the idea is that if you don't vote on party lines, your pre-selection for the next election will be removed, and therefore you won't have a career as a politician, which is what all politicians care about now anyway, which is how do I go to Westminster 3 times a week with my fancy friends and cars and all these interesting crowds that I get to intermingle with, rather than necessarily politics as a function for achieving goals and aims. We used to have kings pursuing crusades. Now we have politicians deciding whether or not they should go to a soiree on a Friday or a meet and greet on a Saturday. So obviously there's a huge distinction between the quality of the candidates, given that the roles are much more, well, less scrutinized, but also less sought out for the personal individual qualities than they are for, will you toe the party line? How much of a lemming are you in general? Is that your personality? I think this kind of leads into the first point, is why there's a supply issue of smart politicians. Now, someone like Dominic Cummings has commented on this quite a bit. He was a former advisor to Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. It's just, I think I would expand on his observations a little bit and just say, like, it's been known for quite a long time, I would say 50 years or so, that if you wanted to earn a lot of money, you would always just pursue business. But now you can also pursue business adjacent careers for more money. Like lawyers are not just, seen as almost status with barristers and things like that, but in general earn a lot of money. Bankers, consultants, which are quite new. Consulting as a career choice is quite a new thing. And then technology, obviously tech companies, and if you're an engineer or even just a business person working in tech, you're always having the opportunity to solve more interesting, what you might consider more interesting problems for much higher stakes economically. So the pecuniary reward of not working in politics is much higher. Civil servants have also gone through a self-selection of why, if I'm getting a first-class degree from Warwick or Oxford, why would I want to go and work for the public sector for £30,000 a year when I can go and work for £150,000 a year 2 or 3 years out of school? There's a huge economic decision to be made here, where the status of and the notion of duty that you are bestowing on people for working in the civil service degrades year on year, because there is just not that much quality to the institution anymore. So the self-selecting bias of who's going to be senior in a civil service is someone who couldn't have made it outside of the civil service, which is indicative of their low quality and spirit. Which means that the reflection of the function of the state is that the civil service is full of dweebs and incompetence, and that the remaining part of the populace, who is functional and generating high levels of economic activity and things like that, are much more selecting these very, you call it almost niche, but politically unimportant careers where they're not involved in politics almost at all. And in fact, if you are so successful, particularly in the UK, at some of these things, like being a finance person or a tech person, you'll end up moving to America, which removes the quality and the talent pool in the UK in general. And that's, once you start on this economic treadmill, all roads lead to California, or Silicon Valley in a way, or New York for finance or something like that, right? So once we understand that the environment that politics is now playing in has been diluted and distilled into this weak and acerbic pool, then we can kind of bring out of it why we're in the poor situation that we are, and then what we can expect going forward. If I look at here a kind of little funny graph I've come up with, which is fairly par for the course now on this channel, but I was able to more or less, I'd say, triangulate in a lot of ways this idea that we're in a position politically where we can consider both party lines and then potentially Caesar-like figures on this axis of whether their pursuits and aspirations are noble and whether they're being intelligent or a bit stupid. Because I think it's easy to ascribe evilness to people you don't like, or you don't respect their opinions on certain things, whereas it's much, I guess, almost Occam's razor to say we can just assume that if someone's being dumb, it's not malicious, but if someone's being malicious, they're usually a bit more intelligent about how they go about it. And you can derive that from the ends that they're pursuing and then the methodology and the modus operandi of that institution. So this is kind of this combination of political activity in a lens of both power and how power plays out in the political realm, but also the personalities and the types of people who either seek power or involve themselves politically. It's interesting because the US and UK are nominally quite distinctly different, but share so many, I would say, well, similarities, but cross-pollination almost of methods and ideas, that you can still intertwine them on this axis quite well, given that they're both two-party systems, and the structure is very top-down in terms of directive on the leader of the party. Nominally is the person who is responsible for the manifesto or the direction of that party. We can see that, and maybe I'll start here with just Max Weber. So Max Weber is a German, was a German sociologist from the early 20th century, late 19th century, I think, and he wrote prolifically, but in general on a lot of really important sociological topics. I super enjoyed his insights from both a historical perspective of what it would have been like to live prior to World War I, but then also how we can think about institutions from a much more, like I say, metapolitical or metaphysical domain of this is why these institutions run like they do. He was a guy who came up with the idea of a Protestant work ethic, but he had also a lot of different ideas on myriad topics. He wrote a book, Economics and Economy and Society, where, and it's a very long book, it's about 1,400 pages, where he details and goes through all these social organisms and how they've been constructed. Anyhow, I've come to able to hopefully adduce and then crystallize some of his ideas here in what is some tables on Weber's, and I didn't make these tables, they were taken from a scientific paper, but Weber's typology of the just legitimate power and authority, and he uses a tri-party system, like a triangular method here, where you have a traditional power or authority, rational, legal, and then a charismatic. And the charismatic is the most unstable of these. It relies a lot on, obviously, the person, and that the person involved sometimes goes from being very charismatic to not charismatic at all, not even including saying things like death or exile or anything like that. It's mostly around whether they can channel what it was that made them cool to begin with. Now we can think of memes in this way a little bit, where there's a very funny meme and then 2 months later it's forgotten and dead, and then no longer has that charismatic power. People are a lot the same way. People can obviously change and grow, but there needs to be the distinct feeling that this person's charismatic enough to give them power over other people. The UK uses a lot of rational legal power. Well, I'd say the Anglosphere probably in general, maybe not to the degree though as much as constitutional political bodies. Like Germany is very constitutionally based. A lot of the Western European countries use constitutions, and the way that they derive legal function and political power is constitutionally, which is a system which is wrought with a lot of different problems, but we can delve into that in a different conversation. And then traditional, and we can see with the tradition there is a lot of this institutionalized power through something like the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Tory Party. These are all traditions and customs, not necessarily an institution which on analysis holds up for its importance. Excuse me. I could say that so this focus on three different types of power then allows us to understand current politics and why someone like Keir Starmer, who has no charisma, who's almost a vacuum of charisma, this negative entity when it comes to being relatable and sociable and someone you want to spend any time with, because he's what we'd call a fuck idiot in German, but someone so monomaniacal around the legal and law of system and process of living, or like this idea that law is the predestined way of becoming. So then this is the very like Heidegger sense of being and becoming, but to say that if you think about everything legally, then the way you operate is very legal, jurisdictional and legislative, and so there's no creativity around how to deal with the chaos of a person and the chaos of a society, because you think only in structures and in very fixed and well understood terms, which is obviously not something that people like, and not a person anyone wants to interact with, because that's a very dull and uninteresting, banal personality. Previously, and this could be said, that a lot of party leaders had to be Renaissance men and these cultured people, because they had to at least sway over a lot of stakeholders across both party lines and then in the public sphere. So someone like Winston Churchill, who was a terrible leader and probably caused more dismay to the English Empire than anyone else individually, was at least personally charismatic in some ways, and to the degree that in every personal relationship he had, he was seen as this jolly kind of fun guy, and it was almost a mode of respect for him that he was able to be elected, even though his public policy and his actual political performance was terrible, was abysmal. So that is to say, we actually do now embrace this fuckadiot, this person who is one-dimensional to a inhibiting degree. There's, in combination with this, a lack of this Prussian essence. And now Spengler talks a lot about Prussianism and socialism in ways that don't sound like the words that you maybe understand when I say Prussian and socialism. But Prussianism to him was this nobility and service, and that's, I think there's generally a lack of nobility and service, and that this old style bureaucratic notion of going into the civil service and taking up positions was, and particularly in Germany, seen as very spiritually uplifting and came with a lot of status and respect, and in general was seen as this positive career where you were the postmaster or the bureaucrat for, it could be anything, statistics or geography or whatever it would have been. So we've lost, and completely in the West, and particularly in America and the UK, this idea of any knightly service to what would be a Prussian idealism. You then have what would be civil servants basically fomenting and festering all of these bad political energies to then spread almost like a toxic nexus outwards to the populace. So you have the inability for a public service to do anything but be destructive, because of that they're not given direction and they're not guidance, and there's no leadership to say the civil service needs to perform functions towards something. It's, you need to run the state as a business but with no operational goals or aspirations. There's no mission statement. All of these things that you would run an organization upon have died and decayed into and solidified into this mess of just try and get through the day, and this is extended towards the government and then outwards into society. You then get this unfortunate reality whereby everything is dysfunctional in ways that can be fixed but won't be due to the lack of political leadership, and we're seeing this feedback loop of lack of political leadership. Now Trump, I would say, is probably the exception at the moment, given that he comes first, and that the fact that he's associated with the Republican Party is almost not accidental, but it's inconsequential. He could be associated to any party, the Democrat or the Republicans, and they would both kowtow to his will, to his whims. You could say he's definitely charismatic, and this is where his charisma, and I think it's unfortunately a product of his age. However, he's turning into maybe what is a Don Quixote type figure, where what he was saying in 2016 resonated much more strongly because his feeling with the same generation but also younger generations reverberated and percolated in ways that was very, at least it felt like he understood your own pains and sufferings, where now he almost feels a little bit like a soundbite machine, and maybe he's fighting some windmills alongside some giants. So we're yet to see. I have called him the probably first Caesar in another video, but the way a Caesar operates is obviously always on this very fine line of charisma, and whether you tip and fall onto or off the pedestal might be a better apt analogy, but that's where he is, that it's a very risky position to rely so heavily on charisma, because it's giveth and taketh away in the same breath. He has no bounds to this traditional and rational legal institutional power, so it is very much that he's relying on personal qualities, and somewhat, and you can see this in the table below, which is just a synergized version of a Weber and Young idealized version of power entity, is to say, like, he has obviously public entrepreneurship and some intellectual policy, whether you agree with his policies or not. He does in general not come to market with very distinct policies that he would say, and he's very ephemeral and nebulous with the direction he wants to take the country, other than, as I said previously, it's America first, and this catechism around you're with me as an American or you're against me as a Democrat or a communist or whatever the pejorative term, casting aspersions on the other, the enemy. So here we can say, I think quite strongly, that if he wins, it will be the last gasp for him as a political entity, just because of his age and his reliance, such strong reliance on what was charisma, to the detriment of this traditional and rational legal. But a more competent Caesar would come ideally first with the charisma, but attach it to tradition in a way that's formulated a little bit more clearly and distinctly around a vision, and not just saying let's return to making America great, but specifically highlighting the goal of here's how we'll be great in a way that's new but still reflects this tradition. The rational legal power will kind of follow that naturally anyway. So what I will say then is, maybe it's best to actually read a little bit on charisma here, and this is from Weber in his Economy and Society. So the term charisma in this context must be used in a completely value-free sense. The heroic ecstasy of the Nordic berserk, the legendary Irish folk Cuchulainn, and all the Homeric Achilles was a manic seizure, which can speak into some discussions we've had previously on heroism and how we deem the Übermensch style. What political greatness can mean is tied towards charisma. You'll never find a political leader who was important who was not charismatic. If you look at the history of American politicians and the UK prime ministers, almost everyone that you remember was charismatic, and anyone you don't remember was not. And that's more or less the case for why is Teddy Roosevelt revered when Woodrow Wilson is not? Why is Keir Starmer such a bland nobody compared to the likes of Lord Palmerston? This is just the general instinct that we have when it comes to what a hero in kind of cognizantly tied towards the political leader and how he embodies that spirit. Below is also around another quote from Weber in the same tract, saying he must work miracles if he wants to be a prophet. He must perform heroic deeds if he wants to be a warlord. Most of all, his divine mission must prove itself by bringing well-being to his faithful followers. If they do not fare well, he obviously is not the God-sent master. It is clear that this is very serious meaning of genuine charisma is radically different from the convenient pretensions of the present divine right of kings, which harks back to the inscrutable will of the Lord, to whom alone the monarch is responsible. The very opposite is true of the genuinely charismatic ruler, who is responsible to the ruled, responsible, that is, to prove himself is indeed the master willed by God. And so this probably is a allusion to first, but primarily Jesus, in that sense that he had to have the charisma to sway his followers that he was the true Son of God. And then I think it's easily understood in that same fashion of there is this, you might almost call it a archetypal leader, but the way that we understand leadership is tied directly to whether we would want to die for the leader in a way that can be made to make sense, because wanting to die is semi-irrational. But when we see it framed as a berserker, then we can understand that why a berserker would be able to lead a party to war, and why they would be willing to go with someone who had no care for their bodily integrity, is because it's such a powerful, magical feeling to follow a leader in that way. This is maybe not understood if you're not Faustian and you kind of have a different understanding. So leadership in, say, East Asia is very much the default position, and there's a very collective identity around how leadership manifests in East Asian countries. I think in general in say the Middle East and Africa, it's much more around arms, and that just the person who has the gun is the leader. There's no consideration around whether they're charismatic or not, and whether they have vision and structure. It's all just, I have the gun and you don't, so follow and say what I do. It's very Mohammedan, it's very warlord, it's very TIA, this is Africa. So when we come to the Faustian West, though, it's much more understood almost romantically around this type of person and how they are channeling this inner spirit, the spirit of Woden, who is deeming you to be the messenger at that point in time. And whether you can continually to have Woden's favor is up to, once again, Woden, but also how you're willing to act and whether you're willing to sacrifice your things, take risks, and be that guy, be that man and that's going to continually be able to live up to Woden's expectations and deem you and have the favor deemed upon you. To maybe more address specifically the plane here and why I've got what I've got where, is to say, like, the Democrats, and I think if you take them as a party, they don't currently have a leader in any meaningful sense. It's almost a committee of leadership in the Democratic Party, a Politburo, where they're determining policy out of this popular vote internally to say, oh, 5 people like this thing and 2 people like this thing, so we'll go with the one with the 5. Which, as everyone knows, is no way to lead anything. You can't have committee defining leadership ever in a successful organization. So here we've got the Democrats probably being quite intelligent, given that everyone at the top of the party is quite intelligent, and malicious in the way that they want the power, but are not willing to be able to propose virtuous power or noble power in a way that's constructive. It's all, we want the power, so then we can do what we want once we're in power. Hence why Kamala, who's I think largely recognized as a Democratic stooge, and then has, I think Tim Walz is appointed as the VP, and we'll see if the nomination sticks all the way through the election, but it's to say that these people are not supposed to be charismatic and they're not supposed to be leaders, because that's not what's wanted. And it's intelligent to understand that they're trying to get what they want out of more or less proposing, I wouldn't say a handicapped race, but they're using other mechanisms in their arsenal to try and destroy Trump and then just offer the alternative. It's very close to what Labour was capable of doing in the UK at the last election, where Keir Starmer is almost insufferable to bear witness to. If you try and listen to any of his speeches or see how his interactions were on the campaign trail, he's got no charisma, no personality, and he is this vacuum of personhood almost. He's like I say, he's a fuck idiot when it comes to just legal matters. He's obviously quite talented, but the complete inability for him to be relatable is perplexing almost. Anyhow, the Labour Party was able to run him in this way that he didn't offend, and that was enough. It was very smart. But now that they've got power, obviously it's this moronic power where there isn't this vision, there isn't this intelligence. So a guy like Keir would have quite a high IQ, but his political IQ is clearly very poor. He just doesn't comprehend it. His ability to be authoritative and to deem and direct is very high. Super capable guy, understands law brilliantly, but that's not politics. Law is not politics. Writing legislation and policy is easy. You hire a bunch of PPE people from Oxbridge to do that for you. They're not evil. So like, he's not going out there trying to be evil. He's just almost accidentally, maliciously treating the rest of the country. He just doesn't comprehend it. It's not something to him. He deems criminals, he deems the unworthies in a way that's just very structured legally. He doesn't see them as people in the same way that you and I would interact with someone from Birmingham. So whereas the Conservatives, I think, are much more slightly more intelligent, but just much more evil. Like, their inability to, for 14 years more or less, progress the country towards betterment and just continually drain and drain and drain is malicious. The way that they were clearly able to solve problems but having no will to do it just only speaks of malice. And that, I think, that level of villainy is emblematic and endemic almost in that party, where you only would choose to be a Tory now if you had a little bit of hate in your heart, because they stand for nothing good. There's not a single redeeming element to their party platform, to their manifesto, to their leadership. It's all a joke. So that level of evil can also be seen in the Republican Party, separate to Trump. So the Republican Party is more or less this appendage to Trump at the moment, where anything anyone else wants that's not Trump related is relegated and is second class. If you took the Republican leadership, you would just find a bunch of men trying to do maybe you would call them noble things in certain domains, but they're moronic. So their incapability kind of leads them into almost being, and it's just, I say, the Republican Party is quite funny because it's like 5 parties or 3 parties in one, where you have, and maybe I can read out Spengler here on this down the bottom here, but this will give you a bit more context. So all the will to special economic interests of individual areas still pull the most weight, and as once before in 1861, lead to the disintegration of the country into separate states, such as, say, the industrial northeast, the farming regions of the Middle West, the Negro states of the South, and the area beyond the Rockies. Now, you know, for the Republican Party's distribution, that they are 3 of these areas. They're just not the West Coast and the East Coast, and that they are trying to combine, amalgam this Frankenstein party together of farmers in Nebraska, but also cowboys in Texas. And these 2 people are very dissimilar, different backgrounds, different wants and wills. And when you combine them, they all have noble intents for the areas that they live in. This is, in general, why they attract themselves towards what would be considered a conservative party. But because their combined inabilities coalesce and manifest in ways that makes them moronic, everyone sees them as the dumb party, which rightfully so that they are, because they are trying to combine 3 parties into one in a very moronic way that the Democratic Party thankfully doesn't have to do. Democrats get the luxury of having the minority vote almost by default, and then only having to pursue policies that liberals on West and East Coast population centres care about, which is fairly in line. There's a very strong cooperative element to that. Hence why you can kind of see why I placed them where they have. And I think lastly, maybe it's good to give the prorogation here on, but neither in the English nation strong, young, or healthy enough, spiritually and racially, to combat this terrible crisis with confidence. Too much of its precious blood was spent in the 19th century for its possessions, was lost by the exodus to the white dominions, and by the devastating effects of climate in the coloured colonies. Above all, it lacks the racial foundations of a tough peasantry, the ruling upper class of Germanic or Celtic race. There is no difference between them, which dates from the conquest, has been used up. The mass of the original population, erroneously called Celts, has forced its way up to a dominant position by its radically different French life feeling. So I think Spengler here is definitely identifying correctly this lack of what you would call leadership nobility, and that what the English was capable of doing up until the end of the 19th century is no longer possible. But there's still the reminiscence and the echo of it in the English populace to say, we were once great, how come we can't return to that? Why is it that the English soldier, which was the foremost and in terms of performance, highest achieving accolade rewarded soldier in the world for like 2 centuries, 3 centuries, and you have to remember soldiers particularly came from Scotland, Ireland, and the underclasses in England, that they ended up performing above and beyond any other soldier from any other country and nation, is because they had in them this warrior Viking spirit. But it got spent, as he says, on these battlefields, and then the political will and the leadership was also spent there. So you have a complete destruction of what the elements required to be great was, and all you have left at home is the chaos farmers of England, which is this paltry and unimpressive milieu of, we just want power because it represents something where I feel like in 5 years and 10 years it would have been nice for me to have been Prime Minister. But there's no leadership, there's no aspirational goal, it's not a divine right to rule, it's just a bureaucrat who stumbled his way up into the party leadership. And this is unfortunately why the incompetence is pervasive. It's permeated all elements of the political society. Maybe just as the round off here is that you have what the UK was and still is this schoolboy, say Eton College, Oxbridge, PPE type. If you go through the profiles of these politicians, they all almost exclusively went to either Cambridge or Oxford and studied something called PPE, which is philosophy, politics and economics. But these drones end up being selected nowadays not out of what would have been a classical, almost competitive right to rule, but now it's this, I don't want to call it meritocratic because it's not, but the privileged types. But the privileged types in England now come from disparate backgrounds who have no blood in them to rule, and there's no leadership abilities. So you get this generic, good at studying, good at filling in functions and bureaucratics, but not at leadership, and all these bozos are more or less formed in the same way. And if you look at both the Labour and the Tories, this is the composition almost of all the political leaning and wanting operatives. So the differences here, and I can just outline them, is that the way I see it at least is the Democratic Party is a feel-good party of some maniacal wretchedness. So it's, how do we make you feel like you feel good, even though underneath it's corruption and embroiled scandal. The Republicans, as I said, is the Trump party at the moment, but they have this diffuse and nebulous obsessions, and this is how it formulates individually but never coherently. You have gun rights as being the preeminent will and want, then you have free speech, but then you have abortions, then you have religious freedoms, and you have a range of these weird farming subsidies and topics that's and never in this coherent goal-styled fashion of, so even an FDR would have had. It's all just diffuse, and it's really hard to align these in a way that's meaningful, and that's why there's so much dissatisfaction with the Republican Party. It's because you have someone like John McCain being a Republican senator for 40 years, even though everything about him is incoherent with someone like Trump, who is also of this same party. It's just nonsensical, right? The Labour Party in the UK is the civil servant party, and as I've discussed earlier, they champion the same sort of feel-goodery that Democrats do in America, but they're also very strong globalists, and they have a love for the world above the love for Englishmen. It's this sense of an international community, and combined with this white guilt shame, they can turn it into this, we'll happily spend money on other people who we feel is disadvantaged and disenfranchised, even if we looked analytically at it and realized that most of our countrymen are probably even more disadvantaged than the ones we're helping. And then the Tories, which are today no one's party, and they're a sentimental party in that they represent something that used to exist, but they have this negative identity. So now they're just catching anyone who isn't a Labour or a something else voter, which is obviously very difficult to come back from. It's almost a death knell. But in any case, hopefully this was helpful. I think for me it's very important that you understand how power is crystallized, and that the way that Trump is performing politics is the way that the entire West will follow. If you can be seen to be charismatic and achieve power, and then also achieve an aim and a goal once in power, then the idea that pursuing money as a function because you're smart and capable becomes actually less of a priority socially, and we'll start to see talent hopefully gravitate back towards politics, and then at some point the nations will actually be great again.